Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your current location. I'd like to welcome you to our Mastering Scribe Online webinar series, where today's topic is going to be REST connectivity. My name is Rich Radaci, Training Manager here at Scribe Software. Now, before we get started, I'd first like to discuss some webinar guidelines. The first one being, the audio lines of this webinar will be muted. You'll be able to hear us, however, we will not be able to hear you. Any webinar content related questions that you may have can be typed into the questions section of your webinar panel. Your questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. I would ask that you please provide adequate detail in your questions regarding the content that you are watching that raised your particular question. This will better serve us in answering your question. The next one is that this webinar will be recorded and it's going to be posted within 48 hours on our website for subsequent review. All attendees today will receive a post-webinar email follow-up providing access to it. Now, should you encounter any webinar-related anomalies, please navigate to support via the help option in the banner of your webinar panel. Now, joining me today is Nate Keefe. He is a platform evangelist here at Scribe Software. Welcome, Nate, and thanks. I really appreciate you joining us once again.
Thanks for having me, Rich.
Absolutely. So, Nate, before we get started with the REST connectivity session today, could you just share with our listeners that may not know you a little bit about your role here at Scribe Software?
Yeah, I'm one of the product evangelists. So I work with our Scribe Platform with bunch of our partners and clients on their integration strategy or maybe their marketplace strategy. So been a long time Scribe Onliner for quite a while now.
Well, actually, you started in the Scribe Insight world as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that, Nate. So, to kick off today's webinar, how about we begin with an overview of our session topics that we came up with so that we can then dive into the specific topic of the day, and that being REST connectivity. Does that sound like a good place to start?
Yeah, so I prepared a couple topics for us today, a couple demos for us to walk through. So what we'll do is I'll start off at very early on what are web services and APIs, take you through some industry trends. We're going to talk a lot about the OpenAPI initiative, and then I'm going to bring that over to the Scribe Online and our REST connectivity, how that works. Walk you through connecting, walk you through mapping, and then show you some of the tools that my team has been working on, the Scribe Labs team. And then I think we want to wrap it up, obviously with questions, but obviously we want to wrap up the differences between this REST connector and then, our SDK, our CDK that's always still available.
Okay, well, that sounds great. I got to tell you, Nate, and for those that are listening in today, that a concern of mine in preparations for today's topic was the fact that since we typically have a diverse level of expertise for those that attend our webinar sessions, my concern was, will this content be consumable by all that attend? And I got to say that, that I had my doubts here, Nate, but based on the content that we have today, I think it's safe to say that we will leave no one behind. What do you think?
No. So we're going to start early in the topic, give you an overview of web services, kind of how they work, how they'll be described, and then how they'll work in Scribe. And so we'll walk you through that, and the slides will be available after the fact. So if I go too quickly, you can always ask a question here, or you'll have the slides afterwards. So for the first couple topics, it's really about the what and why of web services and really what they are, depending on your experience with Scribe and integration. Maybe you already know a lot about web services, and I'll go over this quickly. If you don't, the whole point of web services is they're applications, over the internet. And they're generally there to provide some kind of information from a program, or you're providing you a way to interact with an application programmatically. So usually it's kind of an app-to-app communication. They're not always accessed via web browser, but if you're reading up on APIs and REST, the World Wide Web is the best REST service out there. It's the best example of it. So taking a look at that diagram on the bottom right, web services are what really interacts between the client and the server. And the client could really be, for most of us on here, we're the clients. We're trying to talk to an application via that web service. So we're going to write code programmatically, or we're going to use connectors to programmatically use that web service that's going to talk to it. Maybe it's a SOAP web service, maybe it's HTTP, and it's going to talk to that server on the back end, the Dynamics CRM server, the Salesforce server. It's going to give us information back.
So just to be clear, Nate, you had mentioned that we are the client in this particular model, and I think what you're referring to is that the client being a connector, a Scribe Online connector that has to interface with that particular web service. Is that correct?
Yeah, so a lot of times you'll see our product, our documentation, our blogs, we kind of use web services, APIs, and connectors interchangeably. So kind of understanding what our role is as the client and working with web services will give us a better understanding for how to work with all the REST services that we're going to talk about today. So a little bit more detail into that is that as that client, we want to send a request in, and it's typically going to look like we're going to, maybe an HTTP example, we're going to use a method there. Let's say we're going to get some data and we're going to get that at a certain URL. But there's a little more involved in that. We have to, go through an authorization pattern and authenticate, maybe add some other parameters to our request to tell the server really what we want. Is it account and contact data? Is it lead data? Is it activity data? And maybe we even add in filtering. So there's other parameters that you can add into these requests to tell that server really what you want via the API. And even if you're giving it data, you're going to give it some kind of a media there as well. So once the server gets your request, it's gonna process it and it's gonna send you a response, and that always varies depending on the type of request. You might be just getting back a 200 that says, hey, it's successful, whatever you did worked, or a 201 is more specifically, hey, you created something. So there's always some kind of a response code, and those are things that are clear across the board. They're always the same. It's something you could look on Wikipedia for every type of HTTP code, and then oftentimes too, there's a message with that response code. So it may not just say 200, it might say 200, and then the lead that you attempted to create on the server, here's your new ID, something like that.
Well, there's certainly, looks like there's a lot going on here just to have that back and forth conversation. So is this an example of what a Scribe Online connector is responsible for and really does in the background?
Yeah, so what Scribe connectors are doing is it's helping you abstract all these different layers here that I kind of brushed up on, and working with those. And because there's different types of REST services out there, and there's other types of web services out there too, but for today we'll speak specifically to REST. And the thing about REST is a lot of people will come to us and say, oh, it's a REST API or it's a SOAP API. And those two aren't necessarily apples to apples, because REST is more of an architecture. It's more about how do I add those different features that I spoke to in the last slide for my API. No API is going to support querying the exact same way in REST. It could be something you put in a header or a query parameter, etc. But REST has been around for a while. There's a couple main differences when you look at REST versus SOAP, and it typically has to do with is it service oriented or is it resource based? And REST is resource based, and we'll talk about that later, what that means. But there's lots of different kinds of REST services. The most common one we see is HTTP REST service, but there's other ones out there. Remote call protocol, OData, hypermedia, seen some graph APIs out there. And then I think it's also worth mentioning, OData, we've probably heard of that. That is a type of REST service, but it's a protocol. So there are certain ways that OData web services are implemented so that they all kind of work similarly. And I say that loosely, I'm using air quotes. It's supposed to be a protocol and they work similarly.
So, you're talking about REST, we're talking about OData. What is the difference, if you will, between REST and OData if they're both technically REST?
Think of like a Venn diagram. OData is just a piece of that REST diagram. It's just overlapping it. So it's using the same architecture but it's kind of chosen, hey, like here's how you're going to run queries, or you're always going to use offset and limit paging. There's certain ways that it's been implemented, for example.
Okay, well then, if that's the case, then let me throw this question at you. How do non-OData web services describe themselves?
Yeah, so that's one of the things here is with OData is the metadata service for that. It tells us as users, as the clients of that service, you know, what are the methods and endpoints and all that metadata about it that's available. And that's part of the OData protocol. It is not a part of, you know, because it's a protocol, that's how it works, but not always the same with other types of services.
Okay.
And so that's really the struggle with integration sometimes, is that with an OData service, there's metadata that tells you how to work with it. With a lot of these other lightweight REST APIs, there isn't.
That's a problem.
So that takes us, it's a great problem to solve. And so where we're seeing where the industry is going is they need this too. They need to know how to document these different types of REST APIs. So that's where this OpenAPI initiative has come from. It was formerly known as Swagger. So it's all kind of community driven. It's kind of this open source kind of project, and it's really supposed to be like programming language agnostic. So it's not specifically Java or .NET or anything else like that. It's all about that actual API, and it's supposed to be kind of just defining that service. And so what's really interesting about this is that the way that they do it is via mainly this OpenAPI. They call it a specification, or it's probably formerly like they called it like a Swagger spec.
Mm-hmm.
And they do this. It's both. I think it's both machine and human readable, which is nice because it's in a low markup, like it's JSON or it's YAML, and that'll help us be able to read it as humans. But it also, because it's programmatically readable, we could start building things off of that.
I think your preference, at least based on what I understand, is to use YAML instead of the JSON.
Yeah, I'll show everyone here.
Yeah, well, it's actually on the slide. They can actually see that at the bottom right there. But I did want to ask you this. So this OpenAPI spec, can it define any API? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, well, so it's all about RESTful APIs. And there's certainly, it's more of a framework, so it's not the OData route where, you know, you have to do it this way. There's lots of different options with it, and the spec is there to help you define it. Mm-hmm. So there could be certain rules about OpenAPI specs, about, you know, having duplicate endpoints that do different things. That's not really within the spec. And there's other edge cases in there, but for the most part, this is there for REST APIs and any of the ones that I listed previously.
Okay, well, that makes sense.
So let's do this. Let me help you guys kind of visualize what Swagger is and what OpenAPI is with a short demo here. And I'll show you guys what I mean about kind of having something that's human readable as well as machine readable. So the first thing that I want to show you guys with is it's called the editor, the Swagger editor, and they might have just changed the name recently, but it's editor.swagger.io. And this gives you kind of two panes here for working with a Swagger specification.
And that's not P-A-I-N, right? That's P-A-N-E.
Yes. And so what we'll do is we'll take a specification, for example. Swagger has this example API called the pet store. And so what this editor does, and this is a place where I live a lot when working with REST APIs, on the left, this is that specification that describes the API. And on the right, they call this the Swagger UI. So this is generated based off of the specification, and it's kind of a more intuitive way to look at a REST API, to look at those resources that are available from this pet store API. So each of the main components of this HTTP API are described here, and that was a tongue twister. There was a lot of acronyms there.
The key word, described, right?
So what we see over here on the right are the different methods that I could run. So a post would create a pet, and it's telling me here's the type of JSON body that we're going to accept. And then the other nice thing about this editor is that I could actually, if I wanted to, I could actually try this out. So I could go up here and authenticate. I can put in some information here about the doggy I'm trying to create and execute it. So this is a cool way that you can start working with REST APIs, and you can have this machine readable and human readable code over here that describes it. So one of the other things that Rich, you mentioned earlier, is that over here on the left, this is it's called YAML. And it's basically what you have to know about it is this editor here kind of color codes it. And so here's kind of your keys here in the red, and then you can provide values. This is my preferred way to edit it because as you guys will, maybe this is the first time you've heard about Swagger, not every API has a documentation in Swagger, but it makes it very easy to work with. So if I wanted to make some changes here to one of my APIs, it would actually show up over here on the right. Mm-hmm. So this specification is there to help drive other programs to work with it. And kind of one of the main things with Swagger and why it's gotten so much attention is that you could start to generate clients or servers for this API in various languages based on that specification. So that kind of leads us to our next topic. If I can generate these clients here, you can see where I'm going, Rich, buried the lead. Yeah. We should be able to generate connectors from this here as well. So what we'll do is we'll take you over here, and this is with our REST connector, and this is how the REST connector on the Scribe platform is set up. It's going to be taking in REST APIs based on a specification. So this connector, it's been out in the marketplace now for probably a couple months. And how it works is it's going to read in one of those specifications. So it's fully documented. You guys can check it out online, but it's based on JSON specifications. So I showed you YAML. I'll show you in a moment how you convert it. You just save it off as a different type. It's based on the 2.0 specifications. So those are the most widely adopted specs out there. So there's other versions before and after, but they're the most widely adopted, and it's easy to kind of interchange with them. So once you take those specs in, the other thing that I didn't mention previously is that, I have to authenticate to an API, and that's where the architecture comes in. API providers can choose how they want to authenticate. So the OpenAPI initiative has kind of defined a number of different types of authentications. At the time of the webinar here, these are the authentication types that the connector supports. So if it doesn't have any, maybe it's an internal API, you don't have to authenticate. It could be basic auth, you could be providing keys, and then there's a couple of different OAuth flows, and right now we're supporting the client credentials grant.
Nate, one thing you and I had chatted about in preparation for this is this whole notion about this specification that you import into the REST connector as a parameter for its configuration. And the question was brought up is, all right, what if you don't have a specification? Where do you go at that point?
Yeah, so I think this is a good plug for my blog. On Scribe's blog.
That's unintentional.
I'm writing about the REST connector and working with it, right? So oftentimes an API doesn't have a specification. So what I've kind of written about is learning how the specification works, and then you can roll your own. So you can write a specification to any REST API and then use that in the Scribe connector. Mm-hmm. What I kind of did is I called it my minimal spec. So I give you a sample spec on the blog, and then you can just start defining it. That's great. There's really just a couple key pieces to getting it to work.
Okay. Well, then let me ask you, before we go any further, would you mind just revisiting the OpenAPI spec and explain how you use that with the REST connector?
Right. So what the let me show you. So with the specification here, this is basically going to define the API. So when I look at it over here in the UI, I see my base URI. So everything's going to be HTTPS petstore.swagger.io/v2, and then all of these endpoints here are those individual methods. So what I want to be able to do in Scribe is expose these individual methods, but configure a connection that would say, what's the base URL, and then how do I authenticate? Is there anything else special about this API? So how I would work with this pet store, for example, is this is YAML. We want JSON, but that's not an issue. So I'm going to save this as JSON, and I'll be able to take this file here. I'll copy it. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to plug this over into Scribe.
Oh, that was pretty simple.
So I already got the map open. I'm going to add a new connection to the REST connector. Already just downloaded it off the marketplace, works with cloud and on-premise agents.
That's a free connector, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
So in the connection UI, it's similar to what you've seen with other connectors here, where you're kind of DIYing your REST service. So if you've used like text or XML, the ones where you can kind of add your own flavor to that connection, that's how this one works. So this one I'll call it Nate's Pet Store. And for the first tab here, it cares about that specification. So I'm just going to paste in that spec, all that text in here. This is what Scribe's going to use to generate the connector, the connection. The other thing that we need to give it is that base URI. So this will be, it's right in here from the spec. So if I go to the host, petstore.swagger.io, there's also schemes that would tell me it's HTTPS, but we always use HTTPS. And the base path here is that v2. So remember in the editor, all these methods here, /pet find by status. So we just have to give everything before that. I could have uploaded the spec just from the URL. That probably would have been easier for the demo, but most folks are going to paste it in here. When you do upload it from a URL, it'll just put the text in here. So one of the things different with some of the SOAP web services and REST web services, there's probably not a login method here or anything that says to authenticate. If you wanted to actually do that, you could put a URL in here where we would perform, a get. And if it returned that 200 success code or 200 anything, we would say, hey, this tests correctly.
Good.
There's a couple other tabs here for configuration. I think the main one right now has to do with how you'll authenticate. So those are those 4 bullets on the last slide there. So none, basic auth, username and password, API key. This is what we're going to use for Pet Store. And then right now there's the client credentials grant. And this is just the first flow that we implemented. It just happens to be the friendliest flow with, an unattended app like Scribe. There's other apps out there that'll have different OAuth flows that aren't quite as friendly. So with the API key, the reason I know this is just because of either the API's documentation or it could have been implemented here in the spec itself. So when I go to authorize, it's 2 ways to authorize. There's a different OAuth flow called implicit. You'll see that on my blog. I'll give you all the different types and how to find them. It also has an API key. And it says the name of this is API key. It is in the header. So I'm going to go over to Scribe. It is in the header. The name is API key. And one last thing, it tells me the API key tells you here because it's public. This would be, your secret password, your key.
Right.
So I'll put it in here for Scribe. And then just one more thing, you might have other headers that you want to add to this connection. Some APIs will say, hey, if you add a header that say you're debugging, we won't actually run the API call, but you could see what, we mock it up. So custom headers that I put inside of here, it's kind of the key and the value. Those will run on every single Scribe method. We'll come back to where I can modify those things later, but this is basically what I'll need to get this connection going. So this should go out, read my spec, and it's going to start getting me some metadata.
It looks like it successfully did it.
Yeah. So a couple other things. Now that I went through the first kind of 3 bullets here, the next thing to think about is what that connector is doing with your connection. So we know if we've used other Scribe connectors, once I provide a way to authenticate, the next thing it goes and does when you add a connection, it finds metadata. So what are the actions we can perform on which endpoints? What are those, we call them entities, but in REST, it's most likely an endpoint itself, that resource, and then the properties that are associated with it. So what we've tried to do is, if you look at that Swagger UI, the nice intuitive way to look at an API, we've tried to mimic a lot of that as the entity names, because if you're trying to work with an API for the first time, Swagger is a good tool for working with it. And what we want to do is have kind of the same types of entities and endpoints when you try to bring that over into Scribe.
That makes sense.
And the last thing I'll just say is a lot of these APIs have different hierarchies in those payloads. It could be complex or it could be simple. So this connector, whatever kind of payloads are documented in there for the data types, we're going to be able to support that. So you may or may not have worked with hierarchical connectors, as we call them on the platform, and I'll show you what that means, but this connector will support it.
So based on what I just saw here, you're saying that for each Scribe Online REST connector connection, the connector is going to generate metadata that's going to be based on the spec being used. And with that being the case, the connector delivers, you could say, a one-to-many model, meaning one connector, many APIs. Is that valid?
Yeah, any spec that you have that you put in here, we're basically generating that connector for you as a connection.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Well, so let me go back one more time here to this, where I created that connection. It's Nate's pet store. I'm going to add it. It's going to pull back some metadata. Zoom in a little bit here. And it's going to give me those blocks based on whatever those methods were already implemented. So if I just I'll add another connection for fun. Let's say I'm going to query something over here, accounts for each result, and then let's pull out a couple blocks here. So let's pull out post. So this post, this HTTP verb, we're going to show you all of the posts that were a part of that API. So those are all those posts, and when I get into that, I'll show you how to set those up. But same thing here. If I wanted to get data, it's still called fetch in our platform. Here's all those gets. So when I get a pet by status or get a pet by an ID, I'll be able to use these. And as I go into these, I click into them. Same list here. There's a couple of different parts of these API calls, as we kind of discussed very, very early on. When I hit that endpoint, what we've really done in Scribe is we know how to authenticate, and we know which endpoints there are, but each of these endpoints might have other criteria we want to provide. So in something like a GET, we're probably going to add some filter criteria. So this one only has a 1 in this. It just has a status field in here. So I might go back to this editor. What do I say? Find get pets by status. That's this method right here. Make it bigger. So this is it. This is status, and it could be available, pending, sold, etc. So we could use one of these in here. And this, as I was using that API, this is how I would actually work with it inside of Scribe. If there are other methods in here, maybe this is find pet by ID. You can see this ID in the curly braces. That means it's looking for, here as it's described, it's an integer, it's some kind of pet, it's a unique identifier. We'll show that in the Scribe filter criteria too. Mm-hmm. So we're going to prefix everything in Scribe to tell you where it came from. So this is a query parameter. The other one would be in the URI. So it's say, URI pet ID, and I'll be able to provide those values here. Last thing is that once I wanted to work with this find pet by status, this connector, it's going to only support JSON for today. So what Swagger does is or the spec does, is it describes the models that are going to be returned. So that's how Scribe knows what are the fields that are going to come back in the fields that you want to map and work with.
I can see why you say you spend a lot of time in this editor.
Yeah, so for some folks, this could be, what I have on the screen here could be very intuitive, and we want to bring forward that intuitiveness. But if it's not intuitive, you should still be able to work in Scribe the same way you've known how. So this include tab is going to show me that we're going to get pets by status, but there was some other types of JSON objects or arrays. So this category, that was just a simple type. I want to pull that in. This is kind of like a parent relationship if you use parent-child connectors in Scribe Platform. And then this other one, this tags, that was an array, and so there could be no tags on that pet, or there could be a whole bunch. So this is kind of more like a child object. Mm-hmm. So that's 0 or more. So if you have more complex JSON, we will show you that complexity in here. It'll work through a hierarchy, it'll work down, and then eventually we don't have to wait for this to come back, but we're going to show you all the fields in here and show you those types.
Nice.
Sound good?
Absolutely.
So it's kind of like connector gen for Scribe. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is, okay, we've connected, we see our metadata, and if that was a little too fast for anybody on the phone, again, check out that blog. I'll show it one more time. I'll pull it up on the screen here, and that'll help you kind of walk through it. And of course, if you have questions, you can come on the community as well. So one of the things that the Evangelist team works on here at Scribe is we like to add kind of value for use cases, and it's, I think, finding out how to work with REST APIs has been a lot of fun, but it's also shown that some of those REST APIs aren't quite as easy to integrate with. So there's a couple of nice connectors out there that will help you get the job done when you're building out mappings. And so the first one is the variables connector, and the second one is the tools connector. Those are both documented on our community. If you want to know more about those connectors or see sample maps, they're out there. But basically, the variables connector, it's going to allow you to remember values across source rows in Scribe. It might help you add or kind of flatten or aggregate data. That's a pretty common thing, and we used to do that in a lot of our connectors, Rich. And then the tools connector, there's a couple of cool functions in there for data transformation and encoding that you might want to have that. And one of the things I'll show you guys in a moment too is a use case where I might want to actually map data from the pet store, for example. I'll get a bunch of pets, but if I have to find them by status, I might want to get all those statuses back. And so I'll show you guys 2 examples here as well.
And these are free as well, these connectors?
Yeah, free on any tier, kind of supported by our team in here, tried and true.
Good to know.
And so these are Rich, it's not for like advanced patterns. I would definitely not say that. Yeah. But what REST is kind of being that resource-based kind of stateless. So I can call the API, but what that API provider is trying to do for me is they don't want me to get every pet every time, because that's burdensome for their API and their servers. So they're going to say, here's a couple different ways where you can get those pets. But if I'm an integrator and I want to do a migration of all those pets, I do actually want to get all those APIs. So what this REST connector is going to do, it's just going to expose that raw API for you. And what these productivity tools, as I call them, will help you get those data points out. So let me show you 2 quick patterns.
I think this actually makes your design a bit more efficient as well, right? I mean, productivity and efficiency, I see hand in hand.
That's right. So if I go back in here in this map, our query came back. That's great. But I'm going to exit this because I already have some maps set up. So the first example that I want to provide, so remember that we were looking at this find pets by status endpoint, and you have to provide a status that's required. So I have to say available, pending, sold. There's no way in here to say last modified. That would probably be a different endpoint. So let's say my approach was, I want to get all the pets. I don't care what status it is. So in Scribe, I could have 3 maps. And the first map would say query available pets. The next map would say query pending. And the third would say query sold. I was waiting for you to finish my sentence. Or if I really want to have those maps all run, all those queries run at the same time, what I could do is I can use the tools connector, pull out this query block, and it has one available entity, call it select one. It just gets the date and time. So if you're kind of a Scribe power user, you know, if I query something, everything inside of this for each block is going to be repeated. So if I'm not working with a connection I don't want to work with, this is a nice way to kind of start the map, and then I'll use the fetch blocks, which are exactly the same as a query block, and I'll go and I'll find all the pets by status, and this one will be available, this one will be sold, and then I can continue on from there. So I can have one map to do all these nice things for me, and then you can see in here in the comment box, like if I'm sending those pets somewhere else, this is where I would process those. So that's kind of the first example of that tools connector. And again, check it out on the community. There's a couple of execute operations in here if I need to do transformations. The other thing that connectors have always historically done for us is what's called paging. And so this will be a blog I'm going to write, and it'll be posted up there.
And this is blog@scribesoft.com, right?
Yeah. You could check out the blog. You could search for tags, REST connector. I'm writing a series right now. There's a couple in the works. There's a couple posted out there already. But the next example that I want to provide is around paging. And so what paging does, and the pet store didn't do this, so I have to kind of change the map. So before you get overwhelmed with the map design, Rich, paging is a way, it's beautiful, is a way for, again, those API providers to say, Rich, you don't want all the pets right now, right? I'm going to chunk those up. So just like you've used it in Scribe too. If you have a lot of executions, our execution history doesn't show you a million executions. I know you run your integrations every minute, Rich.
Oh,
we don't show you all those. We say, we'll give you the first page. And, at the bottom, you say next page, last page. That's what paging is. I don't print an encyclopedia on one page. It goes by pages if you want to think about it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So API requests are the same way. So a very common way to do it. When I look at this get, are filter criteria in here that says, how many records per page do you want? And then how do you kind of move that cursor? So in this map here, I said that I wanted 5,000 records per query, which is a great batch operation on the target. But what I can't do is I can't dynamically say in a query block that I want to get 5,000 this time, 10,000 that time. So what I do is I pair it with our variables connector. So I set up a map and I say, all right, to start, we're going to have zero offset, they call it. It's offset and limit. So limit is how many per page. Offset is where my cursor is at, so to speak. So what I do is I'll send this map out as well, is I'll initially start off my offset as 0. And I have another variable in here because the API is nice enough to tell me if I have any more records, which is always great. I don't have to do math, simple math.
Sure.
So select nothing for that first result. Set the offset to 0, set the has more, that's the field that they have it at as true. And then I'll just loop over, every time I loop over that get request, I'll increase my offset by 5,000. So I get 5,000, then 5,001 to 10,000,
sure.
10,001, etc. And so basically what I'll do from this get request is I'm going to process it out to somewhere that I want to work with. So maybe the first time it was, this one was like 500,000, but the next time, based on filtering criteria that I can add in here, we'll do less.
Right.
So these are things you would typically have just happen for you in a connector, or connectors would always do that, and you wouldn't know about it.
Mm-hmm.
Almost every API on here has connectors like that. So this is just another pattern where you can use these tools in here,
right.
For paging, and you'll find a lot of paging is offset and limit. Sometimes Hypermedia will just give you a URL that you would go to, but you could still use the variables connector to capture that and then reinsert it into one of these fetch blocks.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you're talking there that there are some APIs out there that kind of throttle its usage, right? And I think this might work well, knowing that, hey, I can actually design that type of functionality within my map so as to avoid hitting the top stop, if you will, of how many API hits that I'm allowed.
Right. Okay, so that was a quick overview of the connector, some tools, but I think you're probably asking yourself, all right, Scribe, you still have that SDK, right? So one thing to think about, and it's going to depend, right? Would I want to develop a connector, or would I want to go to a certified partner, develop a connector, or should I be using the REST connector? And I think there's a couple of quick things that could help you make that decision. And one is that our REST connector, it's supporting, the most common types to authenticate, media type JSON, has to be REST, not SOAP. It does not support webhooks. That's this one right here, simple messaging. So there's certain things that are kind of, we have other tooling for that in our fast frameworks and our connector development kit. But one thing to think of too is, now that map design, it works fine. That's paging, that's an industry thing. But if this is like my primary system of record, I'm thinking about, do I use the REST connector or do I build a connector for my CRM? Mm-hmm. I think if you're connecting to your system of record, it's going to be in all your maps. You want to have the fidelity of the connector development kit versus a REST connector versus a spec, just so you can do other types of complex things in it. But high level, just be thinking about, is this my main system of record, or am I going to send a couple API calls or a couple of different methods I need to expose, or I need to get data in or out of these types of things here? And not to say that I haven't tried out APIs with hundreds of methods, because it still works, and I just have a longer drop-down menu. There's just other features that you might consider in our connector development kit that you can bake into a connector and just kind of get in all your maps.
Yeah, so these are some of the, as you have there on that PowerPoint, some of the questions that you really need to ask yourself in terms of, do I do REST connector or do I build my own?
Right.
Yeah. And it's another thing here I was thinking about is that if you want to build your own connector, I mean, there's not only benefits that you can build it as robust as you need, but also I think there's this notion where you can actually put it on our marketplace, right? And publicize it and put a dollar figure to it, or some currency figure to it, and sell it. Yeah.
Yeah. So these are high level qualifying questions, and you might need more. But so the way that I think about it as I dig deeper is instead of kind of being high level business or high level technical, I kind of build these steps in my mind about what is the effort that I'm going to put in, and like what's the floor of building connectivity on Scribe, but what's the ceiling also. So business wise, I'm thinking if it's my system of record, I want to have a really high ceiling. So the way I think about it is on the left-hand side here, we have the REST connector, pretty low barrier to entry. I've built a couple of specifications in 20 minutes and gotten, APIs working very quickly. I'll also plug the Scribe Labs, the Evangelist team. We're going to work on some other quick and easy.
That's what the coming soon means.
Yeah, so that's not what we showed today. It's going to be quicker and easier. Again, won't have as high of a ceiling, but we just want to get connected. And those are things that you don't need to develop. Those are things that don't need to get certified and make money on the marketplace. And it's going to work for select things. It's not going to work for every API. But when I cross over the line and I start to work with our software development kit, whether it's the framework or the CDK, there's virtually no limit on functionality. If I don't want to build maps with paging, I don't have to. If I'm working with not a very good API, if they do timeouts, or if there's a pretty strict rate limit, I would probably want to build in retry logic within that connector. Mm-hmm. Other things, maybe just different error handling in there, maybe exposing the right error messages and bringing that, we call it the backfill, into a connector. So you can work with that in a map. Or it could just be customized authentication. There's a certificate required or something like that. So there's a lot of good, deep technical reasons why I would still want to use the connector development kit or the fast message framework. Mm-hmm. So depends.
Yeah, well, with the earlier qualifying questions that we had on that previous slide, in addition to this slide, I really think this provides, myself, yourself, those that are listening in today, some tremendous clarity and focus as to, what your options are and when to go down one path versus going down the other. So having said that, I think that brings us to the close of today's webinar presentation. We certainly hope that this has been value to each and every one of you out there. I want to thank you for sharing this material, Nate. I think it's just a great piece of content, and I think presented in such a way that it makes it's very understandable so that people can start to use the REST connector, or if they want to, go ahead and build their own connector. So having said that, I want to thank everybody out there for their time today, and really appreciate your attendance.